Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're going to be starting a new module, which is about grammar for the IELTS test. Now, something before we get started that I do want to mention is there's not a specific section called grammar on the IELTS test. However, for both the writing and the speaking parts of the test, one of the things that you are graded on is your grammatical range. Now, part of that is using correct grammar without making mistakes. And part of that is also just being able to use a wider range of grammar in different English sentences, right? If you just use simple, easy sentences the entire time, even if you get them completely correct, that is not going to earn you some of the higher, levels of performance on the IELTS test, right? And so that's why it's important to talk about grammar, even though grammar isn't specifically a section on this test. So let's get into it. During this course, there's actually 5 different lessons. Today, though, specifically, we're going to be talking about clauses and the different types. So let's get started. So, what is a clause? A clause is a group of words with a subject and a verb. So, here's an example: hard work is important. Well, there you go. That's a clause because we have a subject, hard work, and we have a verb, is, right? Is a form of to be. Okay, but taking breaks is too. There we go. There's another clause because taking breaks, that's a subject. Is a verb, right? So there we go, subject and verb. So we must learn to balance both, right? We would be the subject, and then learn is our verb, right? So there we go, right? There we go. We have another subject and a verb. And so a clause, some types of clauses, if we have an independent clause, it can actually be a full sentence on its own, right? A subject with a verb can be a full sentence, right? For instance, if we looked at hard work is important and we just put a period there, that would be fine too, right? Hard work is important, bam, full sentence. We must learn to balance both, bam, full sentence. There we go. However, if we include so we must learn to balance both, well, now that's no longer a full sentence. Or if we say taking breaks is important too, that's a full sentence. But if we say, but taking breaks is important too, not a very strong, not as strong a sentence, right? We don't usually like to start sentences with but, right? Or and, or things like that. It's not usually considered to be very good grammar. Okay, so let's talk about what is a phrase. So a phrase is separate from a clause. A phrase is a group of words without a subject and a verb, right? So a phrase cannot be a full sentence on its own. So, for example, a few weeks ago, I went to a store, or I went to the store. Well, a few weeks ago, that's not a full sentence on its own, right? We know that a full sentence must have a verb. This sentence does not have a verb. Okay. Number 2 says, in many different schools across Canada, the mask mandate has been lifted. So the phrase, which is highlighted in purple, in many different schools across Canada, that is not a full sentence. This is a phrase, right? It's a group of words, but there's no verb there. Which word out of these is the verb? Well, that's a trick question because there isn't one, right? There isn't a verb here at all, right? So a phrase is not a full sentence on its own because every sentence requires at least one verb. Sometimes we have helping verbs, right? Or modal verbs, auxiliary verbs, etc., right? We could have many different verbs sometimes, or different types of verbs. But at the very minimum, we must have at least one verb for it to be considered a full sentence for our purposes. Okay, so let's talk about the 4 sentence types. There are simple sentences, compound sentences, complex sentences, and compound complex sentences. And I'm not going to tell you never to use just simple sentences, but what I am going to tell you is to make sure that you have a variety of all the different types of sentences and you're aware of how to create different sentences about different topics for all of these, especially complex sentences. There's actually many different types of them, which we'll get into in a future day. But do make sure that for full points on your IELTS that you use many different types rather than just using simple sentences. Although simple sentences are correct sentences, they will not get you full marks on their own. So, what is a simple sentence? A simple sentence has only one clause, right? So, for example, with a simple sentence, we have a subject or multiple subjects and a verb or multiple verbs, but it's just one clause. It's not two separate clauses. So, for example, I went to the store. Simple sentence. My friends and I visited the cinema. Simple sentence. We saw a movie and ate popcorn. Simple sentence. Okay, so I'm sure you're all probably pretty familiar already with simple sentences. I'm guessing it's the later sentences that you're really here for, so let's get to the next one. What is a compound sentence? So a compound sentence consists of two or more clauses connected by coordinating conjunctions. What are coordinating conjunctions? They're words such as for, and, nor, but, or, yet. And so compound sentences combine two or more independent clauses, right? I guess we haven't went into detail about what's an independent clause, but an independent clause is a clause that can be a sentence on its own, right? So, for example, I haven't seen snow, nor have I seen rain, right? We could split that into two sentences and say, I haven't seen snow and I haven't seen rain, right? Those could be two different sentences, but we combined them, right? We compounded them. We have a compound sentence now. Or here's another one. My mother likes vegetables, but I like fruits, right? So basically, we have our conjunction, our but, and if we remove that but, we would then have just two independent clauses, right? My mother likes vegetables, I like fruits, right? Two simple sentences compounded. Number 3 says, I haven't visited Manitoba, yet it's the place where my husband grew up. So again, if we remove the let's, or the, not let, the let's, the yet, and we just look at the two sentences, I haven't visited Manitoba, full sentence. It's the place where my husband grew up, full sentence, right? So if we remove the coordinating conjunction, then we have two full simple sentences. So basically, the idea of a compound sentence is to use one of these coordinating conjunctions to combine two things if they're related. We could also use more than one coordinating conjunction, or we could use the same one multiple times, right? Technically, it would be a legal sentence to say, I went to the store and then I went to the pool and then I dried off and then I went home and then, and so on, right? We could combine, do a lot of compounding. That said, I suggest just keeping it to 2 to 3, probably 3 maximum independent clauses you're combining, because otherwise we get to run on sentences and those don't tend to be considered very strong English grammar either, right? And so, if you're writing a whole bunch of ideas all in one sentence, it's okay to, split those up a little bit more. Okay. So do keep that in mind too, that, the goal isn't just to make the sentences as long as possible, but do compound them where it makes sense, right? Where it makes logical sense to do so. Do try this. Do try to put a coordinating conjunction to connect two independent clauses together. Okay, so the next one is a complex sentence. So a complex sentence consists of two or more clauses connected by subordinated conjunctions. So things like after, although, as if, as long as much as, and so on. There's a whole list of them you can read here. And these are subordinating conjunctions rather than coordinating conjunctions. Okay? So let's continue to talk about what a complex sentence is. So a complex sentence has one independent clause and at least one dependent clause as well. So, for example, lots of people are signing up for tennis club, whereas no one has signed up for volleyball club, right? So let's identify how come these are complex sentences. Well, this first one, lots of people have signed up for tennis club. Well, that's an independent clause because we could put a period there instead of a comma and our sentence is good to go, right? Lots of people are signing up for tennis club. Done. And then here, the second part, whereas no one has signed up for volleyball club. Right? Now, if we took out the whereas, then we could argue, oh, wait, no one has signed up for volleyball club. Isn't that an independent clause too? And yes, however, in this case, the whereas is attached. If we include the whereas and say, whereas no one has signed up for volleyball club, that's not a full sentence on its own. But it is a group of words that has a subject and verb, right? So therefore, it is still a clause. It's a dependent clause. So in this case, we're connecting a dependent clause, right, with an independent clause. Whereas for the compound ones, I know I did mention that saying, but I like fruits as a sentence, that's a pretty weak sentence. It's not good to start a sentence with something like but or and or yet. We technically could, right? We technically could and it would be okay. However, it's not something I suggest you do. Whereas this is different because we actually can't do this. It would actually be incorrect to claim that whereas no one has signed up for volleyball club is a full sentence. That wouldn't be right. Whereas to say, but I didn't get much sleep last night, well, technically it's a full sentence, but using starting with but, right, or any sort of coordinating conjunction is not a very strong way to start our sentence. It's not generally how we start sentences. Okay, let's move on to number 2. If I don't go to bed on time, I will be more likely to sleep in, right? So here let's start with the first part of this. If I don't go to bed on time, well, is that a full sentence? No, it isn't, right? We have a subordinating conjunction there, right? And that subordinating conjunction of if needs the second part to it, right? If I don't go to bed on time, then what, right? We're kind of left asking, well, then what? What if we don't go to bed on time? We haven't completed our sentence. And then we answer that part by saying, I will be more likely to sleep in, right? Now, that said, I will be more likely to sleep in. This is a full sentence on its own. So this is an independent clause from us. Okay. Number 3 says, in order to score highly on the test, I will need to study all the material fervently. Okay. So this one again, if we just look at this first part, the dependent clause, in order to score highly on the test, well, is that a full sentence? Well, no. We would be left asking, well, what do we have to do in order to score highly on the test? What do we have to do there to achieve that, right? And then it answers it with the independent clause, I will need to study all the material fervently, right? But that said, I will need to study all the material fervently. That is a full, complete sentence on its own, right? So that's the difference between compound and complex, is that here we're connecting an independent clause and a dependent clause. And the last one, we're connecting two independent clauses using a coordinating conjunction versus a subordinating conjunction here. So there's the difference. Okay, so a compound complex sentence. This is kind of the combination of compound and complex on their own. Basically, it's a combination of a simpler compound sentence and a subordinating conjunction. Okay, or another way we can think of it is a compound complex sentence has two or more independent clauses and one or more dependent clauses. Okay, so here's an example. Although I want to go to Vancouver, I haven't planned the trip and I haven't found anyone who wants to come with me. Right? So here, if we just look at I haven't planned the trip and I haven't found anyone who wants to come with me, well, that's two independent clauses being joined by and, right? By a coordinating conjunction. And so, right there, that's a compound sentence. And then we're making it a compound complex sentence by adding in a dependent clause, which is although I want to go to Vancouver, right? It's like, although I want to go to Vancouver, what's next, right? That alone couldn't be a sentence, but the compound complex sentence starting with I haven't and then ending with come with me would be a sentence on its own. It could be its own sentence as well. In fact, both independent clauses could be I haven't planned the trip, full sentence, or I haven't found anyone who wants to come with me, also a full sentence. But although I want to go to Vancouver, that's not a full sentence. Okay, here's another example. Because I work as a janitor, some people expect my house to always be clean, while others expect the school to always be clean. right? So there we go, another example. Number 3, if we go to the cinema today, then I won't have time to go grocery shopping, and my friend won't have time to clean the kitchen, right? So there we go. We have at least 2 independent clauses, right, combined with dependent, right, with a dependent clause, right? We can verify that because I work as a janitor is not a full sentence, right? Because I work as a janitor, what, right? So what? Or if we go to the cinema today, it's like, well, that's not a full sentence. If we go to the cinema today, then what, right? Okay, let's talk about dependent versus independent clauses in a bit more detail. So, a clause, again, as we know from our very beginning of today, it's a group of words with a subject and a verb, right? A dependent clause cannot be a full sentence on its own. Because I was hungry. Well, what happened because you were hungry, right? We would have to ask because this isn't a full sentence. Whereas an independent clause can be a full sentence on its own, such as I ate a banana, right? Now we can combine them, right, into a complex sentence by saying I ate a banana because I was hungry, right? We can do that. We can combine a dependent and an independent clause in order to make, in order to make a sentence, a complex sentence to be exact. Okay. Let's talk about 3 different types of complex sentences. And then, actually, next time we're going to go into even more detail about all of these and all the different ways they can be used. But today, we're just going to kind of do a brief overview because I want to get these into your brain before you watch the next lecture video. So that way, if you end up watching it in a couple days or you're, taking the synchronous course and watching it live, then these will already be in your brain a little bit from today is my goal. My goal is to give you kind of a surface level understanding today, and then we go into more detail about them next day. Okay, so adverbial clauses answer the questions such as how, why, when, and where. They're created by connecting an independent clause and dependent clause, right? Because again, adverbial clauses are dependent clauses that go along with complex sentences, right? And they use subordinating conjunctions, right? Because, although, if, while, and so on. So here's an example. Number 1 says, I went to the store because we were out of milk. So because we were out of milk, that's the dependent clause, and AKA that's the adverbial clause, right? And so if I asked you, why did you go to the store, right? Why? Or I went to the store. Why? Why did you? Because we were out of milk, right? That could be a conversation people might have, even though technically because we were out of milk, it's not really a full sentence on its own, but some people may still say that, right? Not everyone always talks in full sentences all the time, although for the purpose of the IELTS, you definitely should. It's certainly not something people really do all the time. Okay, number 2 is the problem will get worse if we continue to ignore it. Okay, let's talk about relative clauses. So, relative clauses are used to modify or tell us more about a noun using a relative pronoun such as who, which, that, or where. And also, relative clauses come come after the noun. So, example 1 says, Ron, who is Harry Potter's friend, has red hair. The relative clause here is in red. It's highlighted on purpose there. It's who is Harry Potter's friend, right? So it comes right after Ron to indicate that we're talking about Ron. We're telling the reader an extra detail about Ron other than that he has red hair. We're also saying he's Harry Potter's friend, right? So we're giving an extra detail about him, right? Number 2 says, I went to the park that is next to my friend's house, right? So again, we're learning more about this park. We're learning that this park is next to my friend's house, right? So we're giving extra information here in a way, but we're also just being more specific in this case. Could be another purpose for this sentence, because if I just say I went to the park, well, which park, right? If I say I went to the park that is next to my friend's house, I might be more likely to say, oh, okay, I know which park you mean, right? So there you go. There you go. It's adds extra details for number two, but also it serves a purpose of being more specific, right? Number three says the University of Toronto is a place where people can obtain an education, right? So before we're just saying the University of Toronto is a place. Well, great. But can you tell us more about the place? Oh, it's a place where we can obtain education. Great. So we learned more about the University of Toronto, right? Um, so there we go. That's relative clauses. They modify or tell us more about a noun. In the first case, it was Ron we were talking more about. The second case, it was the park we talked more about, and in the third place, it was the University of Toronto that we talked more about. Awesome. Okay, let's next talk about noun clauses. So, noun clauses answer the question who and what, and noun clauses come after the verb. And the reason they're called noun clauses, even though they come after a verb, is because they take the place of a noun, right? They're a clause that can kind of take the place of a noun. Number one says, I agree that we need to build more housing, right? If we just say, I agree, that's a full sentence. But the noun clause tells us more about that agreement, right? The noun clause answers the question, what? Well, I agree. Oh, well, what do you agree with? I agree that we need to build more housing, right? There we go. That's more specific. Or, again, I believe. Well, that's a full sentence. But it's like, okay, what do you believe? Oh, I believe that the Special Olympics will be in Berlin this year. Okay, great. That's more specific, right? So it might not be obvious what we agree with, what we believe, or what we know, unless we add a noun clause right after to explain what do we believe, right? Or who do we believe, or what do we agree with, or what do we know, right? I know is very different from I know that there are multiple components of the IELTS test, right? So there we go. All right, so let's talk about some key takeaways here before I go for the day. So, some key takeaways for not just today's class, but just in general, these grammar classes that I want to make sure I get across here and that I will repeat consistently throughout this are that what you have learned in the writing is, in this grammar course, it's going to be important for the writing and speaking sections of the IELTS, right? There's not a specific grammar section, so you're not going to be asked specific questions. So, for instance, you will not be asked what's a dependent clause or what's an independent clause. However, you'll be expected to use them both, right? You'll be expected to use them both in your writing, even though you won't be asked to name them. Same with compound sentences and complex sentences. You'll be expected to use both of those, but you will not be expected to identify, oh, this is a compound sentence and this is a complex sentence, right? No. To achieve top marks, you're going to have to use what you learned today and use what you learn in the other grammar lessons. However, you won't actually have to identify them. And so I wouldn't be too concerned about remembering which one's a noun clause and which one's dependent and what's independent and what's a compound sentence versus a complex sentence, because you know what? You're not going to be asked about that on the IELTS. The most important thing is to go over all of these and make sure you can properly identify and understand why each example is an example, and also make sure that you can come up with your own examples as well and use them in the context of the writing part of this, right? That's why I suggest taking this course first if grammar is something you struggle with, so that then when we do get to the writing parts, you can kind of look and say, oh, look, in this example, here's a complex sentence, here's a compound sentence. And when you're doing your own writing for the IELTS practice, you're remembering this and also what we learn in writing of how to actually structure your work, right? Because I do go over in the writing part of this course, how do you structure your writing? I don't really go over why the grammar is proper grammar, right? I'm going over that here instead, right? I'm going over that here instead separately rather than doing that in the writing course too. I talk a little bit about grammar in the writing course, but not really. Not really. I mostly talk about it here. But, anyways, good work today, everyone, and I will see everyone next day. Next day, we're actually going to learn more about noun clauses, relative clauses, and adverbial clauses in more detail and all the different ways in which they can be used. So, good work today, and I'll see everyone then. Bye, everyone.